Good morning and welcome to another episode of Marlins Monday. My name is Eric Wiedeke. As always, you can follow me on X/Twitter, Eric Wiedeke. It is Monday, July 28th, 2025, and there is a lot to talk about here on this final episode prior to Thursday's trade deadline for the Miami Marlins. Firstly, I do just want to encourage you guys, as always, to like, comment, and subscribe, as it does help what we do on the channel here at 5 Reasons Sports, covering the Dolphins, the Heat, the Marlins, the Panthers, the Hurricanes, Inter Miami, anything South Florida sports. It is covered here every single day. Now, I do just want to get into the Marlins here as they went for the sweep on Sunday, unsuccessfully blowing a 2-1 lead in the 8th inning to lose that ballgame, but still coming away from Milwaukee with 2 out of 3, as impressive as it gets, beating a Brewers team that had gone 9-1-1 in their last 11 series, won 12 of 13 before facing the Marlins and dropping 2 of 3 to the Surging Fish. 25-13 now over the last 38 games, one of the best teams in the NL of late, period. And it's created a lot of really interesting discussions around the Miami Marlins here ahead of the deadline. They are going to be in St. Louis today for their final series prior to the deadline here Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and they will be off on Thursday. But before we get into that, I do just want to talk a little bit about the series against the Brewers. I mean, I think the really impressive thing was you win the first 2 games when really on paper you were disadvantaged in terms of the pitching matchups. You had Quantrill going versus Peralta, and Quantrill was fantastic. The Marlins bats were extremely disciplined in each of the first 2 days here, seeing Peralta and then against Quintana finally getting to a lefty a little bit. It was good to see guys like Dane Myers kind of break out of his slump just a touch. Maybe we'll see. That's still TBD, but a good sign to see him hit the ball with authority. Drew a walk on Sunday, stole a base. But even more than that, I do just want to talk about here some really encouraging signs for the Marlins as a whole. Obviously, the bullpen's been fantastic. They did blow the game on Sunday, but I mean, you can't expect them to be perfect all the time. And the Marlins didn't really give them much room for error as they only put up 2 runs in that game. Some really costly base running errors. You get picked off at second and then picked off trying to steal second when you had 1 out and runners on first and second. So just kind of a hard luck loss there versus a very good Brewers team. So you can't really fault them too much for that, but taking 2 out of 3, still very encouraging. Another series win. They've won each of their first 3 series out of the break, beating the Royals, beating the Padres, beating the Brewers. It's not the easiest stretch in the world. 2 of these teams are in the wild card hunt in the National League, and the Royals right around where the Marlins are, hovering around 500. So none of this has been, beating up on really bad competition here. This has all been pretty stiff competition for the Marlins, and they've continued to play well here through the break, especially Kyle Stowers, who, I don't think he's getting enough talk for what he's been doing in July. 371 average so far, 10 homers, a 13-15 OPS. Obviously still 3 games remaining in the month, but if things hold as they are and he continues to play well, we could be looking at potentially the best single month by any Marlin hitter in franchise history out of Stowers. Has the batting average up to 299. The OPS is north of 950, knocking on the door of 960. In any other, normal world where Shohei Ohtani isn't an absolute freak of nature, I think that there are some real conversations about whether or not a guy like Stowers should be in the MVP conversation. Because anytime you look at a batter that's got an OPS close to 1,000, I think you just have to have those discussions. And Stowers has been that good this season. Obviously not going to win it, but he might collect the Silver Slugger this season for his troubles. Another guy that I want to discuss here is Yuri Perez. He's been fantastic in the month of July. I didn't even realize how good he had been. Obviously, he had the 3 straight scoreless starts, but you go through the end of the month here, and his month is already finished up. Perez 3-1 with a 129 and a .64 whip in 28 innings in July. He's really found himself again. And the scary thing is, you go to a start like yesterday, and I didn't really get the sense that he was at his best. He was a little erratic, even though, didn't really present itself in a lot of walks. But I don't think he had his best stuff, and he was still, 5 innings, 1 earned run, really, really good Yuri Perez. Just, he's been phenomenal. I think he's the guy that's going to anchor your rotation for the next 8 to 10 years if you play your cards right with him. The next step with him right now is kind of stretching him out and continuing to get him comfortable with a heavier workload and really kind of transitioning him into being that workhorse kind of ace. Although with your bullpen, I don't really know if you need that from him, at least not at this point. And that brings me to a really interesting conversation, because I think there's been a lot of noise within the Marlins fan base of late, and the media world, whatever, about what this team should be doing. Should they be buyers? Should they be sellers? Should they be, should they stand pat? Because they could decide to do that if they wanted to. And I don't think that would be the worst thing in the world if they decided, you know what, we're going to hold on to Sandy. We're going to hold on to Edward Cabrera. We're not going to sell for anything less than a fantastic package. And I wouldn't be averse to that. But I do think there is some trimming that they can and probably should do. When you've got a bullpen like the Marlins do right now, where it's Gibson and it's Simpson and it's Phillips and it's Bacher and it's Bender and it's Henriquez and it's Fauché. I mean, none of those guys mentioned are bad options. In fact, they're pretty good options. They're options that I would imagine in a lot of cases contenders would be interested in. So I think that there's conversations to be had about which guys in the bullpen are moved. I mean, at this point right now, I think Anthony Bender is the obvious choice. If for no other reason than I think he gets you the most in a deal. And I think that that's what you should be factoring in the most. I think Bender is a good candidate to get moved. Fauché, he hasn't had the best season. But you look at his experience this year as a closer, he's got 10 saves. I think that's going to probably matter to somebody that he has experience in those situations, even though he hasn't been locked down this season by any means. So I think you're looking at a couple guys out of the bullpen being moved. I think this is going to be kind of a sell to buy kind of deadline for the Marlins. And really, I think when you look at specifically what they want to do with this roster and how close they are, I think that they're really close. And speaking of really close, we had some reports come out in the last week about Sandy and, the people around him, quote unquote, knowing that he's going to get traded, and Sandy's already packed up his things. I'm not so certain on how much I really buy that stuff. But if I were to entertain it, and I do think that it's a very real possibility he gets moved, I think it's more likely than not, although I take issue with the framing of it as like imminent and it's going to happen. I think we can look at recent history and say, okay, well, what kind of deal are the Marlins going to be looking to make? I think you look as recently as a guy like Trevor Rogers. Now, Sandy's still got higher value than Trevor Rogers did at the time last year at the deadline. Much higher value. But Trevor Rogers still netted you Kyle Stowers. And I think that any kind of deal with Sandy would kind of net you a similar return in that you'd be looking at guys that can kind of fill in gaps for you and get called up within the next month to really help you at the major league level. And I would hesitate to say that that's really even selling, so much as it's just kind of, I mean, sure, you're shedding payroll. Absolutely. That's 100% part of it. I'm not going to run from that. You know, part of the discourse around this and around Sandy, really, that kind of, listen, I like Sandy. I am somebody that thinks eventually he'll get back to being a good starting pitcher. I don't think he'll get back to Cy Young level, but I think he'll get back to being a good starting pitcher at some point. But I think that there's a lot of conversation and some dissonance in terms of what he is and what he can be. And I think that this is a similar issue to Trevor Rogers. Trevor Rogers right now is fantastic. He's been pitching out of his mind for the Orioles this season. I'm extremely happy for him. He's been phenomenal since he's been called up to their big league club this year. But I'm still making that deal for Trevor Rogers because I don't know if he was going to ever get back to that level with the Miami Marlins. And I'm not sure about Sandy getting back to that level with the Miami Marlins. And so you look at what he is right now, and he's been better lately, sure, but you're looking at a guy with an ERA north of 650 who can net you a top 100, maybe 2 top 100 prospects. I think you make that deal 10 times out of 10. Because even if he does get back to being a good starting pitcher, that's still adequate value. Still. And if he doesn't, then you fleece somebody. And again, I'm a supporter saying I think he's going to get back to that level, but I'm still good with making that deal. Like I said, I don't even really think it would be selling. You'd be shedding salary, sure. I would hope that that's reinvested into the roster, maybe an extension for a Perez, maybe an extension for a Ramirez, Stowers, something of that nature, buying out Stowers' arbitration years, what have you. Because I don't really know if that would be selling, because I think you would just be kind of reallocating assets to, okay, well, we have a lot of depth in the minors when it comes to our starting pitching, and they do have a lot of depth. And I think well, if we move Sandy, we can improve our corner infield spots. We can improve our outfield. And that's more so what I think it's about. I don't think it's about, oh, well, we're going to deal Sandy and improve organizational depth at the low levels of the minors. That's not what it's going to be. I think if you're looking at recent history and you're looking at what's been prioritized in trades by this front office, it's typically, with the exception of a few deals, it's typically been guys at the upper levels of the minors that can make an impact for your team sooner or later. You look at moving Jazz for Agustin Ramirez. You look at moving Rogers for Kyle Stowers and Connor Norby. You look at moving Tanner Scott and getting Robbie Snelling, who's knocking up on the door of a promotion. You look at moving Luis Ariz and getting Jacob Marcy, who's knocking on the door of a promotion. So I don't really know so much if this team is going to be selling. I don't think that's really what you could even categorize it as. Sure, yes, it might appear that way. They're going to be shedding salary. They're going to be adding younger players. Absolutely. But I don't think that they're touching the quote-unquote core of this team. And I think that they have plans to replace those guys almost immediately. And speaking of the plans to replace those guys almost immediately, I think one of the things that's making these decisions a little bit easier is looking at the depth that you have in the minor leagues, specifically at the starting pitching spot. 2 guys that have been recently promoted are their top 2 prospects in the system. in Thomas White and Robbie Snelling. Each of those guys have been hugely impressive at their new levels. White, in his most recent start, went 5 scoreless, struck out 14 batters. He still needs to get stretched out a little bit more. 77 pitches the other day was the most that he's pitched since being called up to Double-A. He's got 5 starts, only 20 innings, but he's pitched to a 2.25 ERA. 33 strikeouts in 20 innings is just ridiculous stuff. To just 10 walks and a 194 batting average allowed. Robbie Snelling, his last start at AAA on Saturday, he struck out 11 and 6 in 2/3 innings. 3 starts for him. He's pitched 15 and 2/3 innings to a 2.30 ERA, 16 strikeouts to just 4 walks, a 2.30 batting average against. Snelling is ready to go right now. I mean, I understand it's only been 3 starts at the AAA level, but you know, I'm somebody of the mindset that, you know, it used to be you could call guys up from Double-A, and I still think you can for the most part. So I think Snelling getting the starts at AAA is really more about getting him used to seeing more veteran players. You know, guys that have just been around the block a little bit more and seen a little bit more, and kind of getting that experience before coming up to the big leagues. But I don't think he's far away. I think maybe a handful of starts more if he continues at the pace that he's pitching at, and he'll be in the majors. I think that's a pretty easy call. White at Double-A, I don't think he'll get to the majors this year, but I wouldn't be surprised if he has a strong August, if he doesn't get a cup of coffee, 2-3 starts at the AAA level. And I have no reason to believe that he won't have a strong August with the way that he's pitched all season long, with the way that he's pitched his entire time in the minors. Thomas White has been absolutely filthy since he's set foot in the Marlins organization, and I have no reason to think that he's going to stop now. And I think he finishes the season in AAA. I think he starts next year at AAA, and I think he pushes for a rotation spot as early as maybe May. So I think that makes the decision to move Sandy a little bit easier, or even a Cabrera, when you know that you've got White, you've got Snelling, you've got Weathers kind of just hanging out in the chamber. Who knows what the plan is going to be with Jansen Junk long-term. I don't think he's a long-term answer, but he might be. He's been good. Braxton Garrett's going to be coming back from his surgery. We don't know what he's going to look like, but he's an option. Max Meyer's going to be coming back from surgery. I think he's going to come back as a reliever, but he's an option. Adam Mazur, he's an option. So I think that there's a lot of depth to compensate for any losses that you have in the major league starting rotation. And I don't think that it's particularly, you know, damaging moving Sandy or damning or anything like that of this front office if they make that call. And then the last thing that I do want to touch on is kind of the first base situation, because it's kind of ugly. It's ugly right now, man. I mean, Eric Wagman has been a net negative for this team. He's had a horrid July, been one of the worst position players in baseball so far in July. And the guy knows it. Listen, I'm not here to harp on him. It's just the numbers say what the numbers say. I'm sure he's a great guy in the clubhouse, and you know, I know he wants to get it right. He doesn't want to be, you know, performing like he's been performing. But the goal of this game is to win ball games and help your team win. And right now he hasn't been doing that for this Marlins club. And, you know, I think you look at a guy like, call me crazy here, but, you know, I look at what Jacob Berry's been doing at AAA of late. You know, you go over his last 34 games here, he's hitting .315. He's hit 5 homers. He's gotten on base north of 400 and a slugging percentage north of 500. I know he hasn't had a lot of time at first base this season at AAA, but he's got a pretty extensive history there in the minors. He's an option. I wouldn't be averse to it at this point, because you look at the approach, and I think the approach plays. Now the batted ball stats, who knows? But I think the approach plays for a guy like Jacob Berry. And then the other thing to consider there, and I'll give Fish on first the credit for this, because I hadn't heard this prior to reading something from them earlier this morning. But Heriberto Hernandez has been taking ground balls at first base. And you know what? I like the idea of that, especially if, nothing's going to be done in the outfield with a guy like Jesus Sanchez. And it might not be done with him. He might not get moved. Then you got to find ways to get Hernandez's bat in the lineup, because he's been fantastic. I mean, he's been really good since being called up. It doesn't look like it's been a fluke. He doesn't strike out a ton. He hits the ball with authority. He's got a pretty good eye at the plate. He does all the things you want a hitter to do. And if he can get that experience, he does have some experience in the minors at first base. But if he can get comfortable with that position and he can play that position, and then it becomes a Hernandez Hicks kind of platoon at first base, more than a Wagaman Hicks platoon, I'm all for that. I think that gives you a much deeper lineup on a nightly basis, and puts your team in a better position to win. And so for an already potent offense, adding a guy like Hernandez on a consistent basis, I think makes you even better. And, I hesitate to say that they'll make the playoffs this year, but at 4 games under and only 6 games out of the wild card, I think they've got as good a shot as any team right now, at least that's not in a wild card spot at the moment. Sure, they have a difficult strength of schedule up ahead, but they've beaten some pretty good teams here to start the second half. The pitching is going well. The bullpen's going well. They're hitting better than I can remember any Marlins team hitting over a protracted stretch. So this team is going to be really fun, and it's going to be really interesting to see what they do at the deadline. Hopefully they come out of St. Louis with a series win, and they make some moves at the deadline. And we're excited about a series at home versus the Yankees. I know Lone Depot Park is going to be filled to the brim for that one. You're looking at ticket prices way north of anything the Marlins have seen at Lone Depot in a long time. So it'll be a really interesting week up ahead for the Marlins, and I will see you guys next week for another episode of Marlins Monday. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you next time. Do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Once again, I've been Eric Wiedeke. That's at Eric Wiedeke on X/Twitter to get more of my thoughts. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.